Hello, everybody. My name is Jacek Bartosiak. Welcome to Strategy&Future. And as you can see with me today is George Friedman. Hello, George. How are you?
I'm fine. You too?
Yeah, me too. Me too. Prior to recording, I started conversation with George off record that when he asked me how I feel, how I am, I said I'm in the midst of analyzing the vast procurement that Polish government has just announced, that we're buying like everything, including more than 1,000 tanks and etc. So Poland becoming in the future, prospectively, a major land power in terms of the military, at least dimension. And what is George's assessment of that, of this development in terms of geopolitics and also military strategy? And then I promised that we would need to discuss it on record. So, George, the floor is yours.
Well, Poland has emerged as a dominant force in Europe itself. Germany is no longer a military force. The British perhaps could be, but Poland is now the dominant force. And it's made the evolution, I think, very effectively to that of a significant regional power, right? Now it has to make a transition to the 21st century, in the sense that it is always the tendency of nations that emerge to take their bearings on weapon systems acquisition by looking at the weapon systems that existed in the previous generation with the great powers. Well, this leads you to have armor. It leads you to have air superiority, manned air superiority, all of which are necessary. But there's been evolutions in technology of enormous importance. It is possible for infantry to engage armor and defeat it. This we already saw in the initial phase of the war. It is possible to have unmanned aerial vehicles, which I prefer to drones because it describes this. This is a air attack system. It simply doesn't have a man on board, but has it somewhere else. It has a different communication system that has to be attacked and defended. Okay, so it's a very different war. And if you're going to protect Poland, forgetting attacking for a moment, the tank on tank battle is obsolete. It's not the tanks that supplied. It was the Javelin missiles that hurt the Russians. So the tank becomes a weapon that appears to be extremely powerful and decisive. Yet we've evolved into a new age of weapons where the tank is not only vulnerable, but finds it very difficult to defeat its antagonist because it's not built as an anti-infantry weapon. The infantry can hide. Similarly, manned aircrafts have become more and more complex and effective. Their mission and air attack is maintain air superiority and simultaneously attack targets on the ground. Well, the bomb is of a certain size. Is that the best way to deliver that weapon to that location? Because by buying aircraft, there's many other things you can't buy. But this is an evolution that has to happen in Poland in the sense that it's almost suddenly it became power. For me, it wasn't sudden. It was something that was happening continually. But having gone there, now the military has to look at all the things they envied that they can now get. And stepping back and taking a look at the battlefield, learning from the Russian failures, learning from the Ukrainians, I mean, that's very difficult. It's a very different war than they expected. In a way, all of Europe expected the next war to be the Cold War, with armor facing each other, F-111s attacking back and forth, and so on. This was a certain war. It wasn't the war you're going to have.
Yeah, of course, I'm preoccupied quite a lot about this sort of not following up with the evolution of the battlefield. On the flip side, there is a huge procurement for the long-range artillery, both MLRS and tube artillery, and even for some aircraft, and also a lot of javelins and other things, ATGMs. So we will see, and some even satellites, some elements. So this is a mixed bag. But in terms of the strategic signaling, that sends a powerful message. 2 weeks ago, across the region, speaking of the intermarium, 2 weeks ago, I had an interview on the Lithuanian radio, in English. People can access it on YouTube. And, the Lithuanian brothers asked me, the people from the crown, because, Poland is a crown, Lithuania is a duchy, and the Commonwealth, right? So this is the subtlety of the region. And, they tell me, so what are we up to? And I said, how come? We're going to face Russia, and we're going to feel the force that will defeat Russians in the field. The Lithuanians, of course, being a small nation, completely, it's those crazy Poles always really wanted to take on someone. This. And now when they hear the news that we're buying like more than 1,000 tanks, 600 howitzers, and so on, you can imagine what is here growing in the intermarium, in that respect. So this sentiment, I wanted to say about the signaling the sentiment, this intention, strategic intention.
So you have to understand that Poland is paralleling the rebirth of Germany. Germany was reborn because the Americans based lots of weapons there. And that's not because the weapons but the Americans spent a lot of money. It drove the economy. Now, Poland is in the position of Germany in the 50s. It occupies a strategic point in Europe. It blocks the Northern European plain. It provides support for the Balkans. It has the ability to provide mobility up and down the intermarium if it chooses to. This is what in the Cold War was Germany. This is a strategic point, which means that there's one advantage you have. You have a relationship with the United States. Not that the United States is so virtuous or anything like that, but it is the overarching power. An alliance militarily with the overarching power in the world gives you opportunities other powers wouldn't have. So one of the things that inevitably Poland must do is align itself with the United States. But this is not difficult because the United States and Poland are completely aligned on what to do. The second thing is Poland must, by its nature, embed itself in American strategy. It can't wage its own war in Ukraine because it needs the weapons and everything else. So just as Germany, and then failed, took advantage of the American presence to craft a strategy, and gave it up, Poland must now craft a strategy in that basis. So the strategy of Poland is to guard the North European plain. Poland must do that. So your primary purpose from an American point of view is defensive. We do not want the Russians to go through Poland to Germany. This is not something that can be allowed. And you're perfectly situated for that. And you must be armed for that mission first, because the Americans will tell you that you must be armed for that mission first. The Americans are not particularly delighted at a major offensive role for Poland, because we understand that in that offensive role, if Poland gets in trouble, we have to go in.
Yeah, it's about escalation control. We understand.
So you have your development of weapons is deeply embedded in geopolitical reality. Mm-hmm. It is not simply the optimal weapon, but considering, what role you pay to acquire these weapons. In the end, Poland will be an independent power, confident and capable, but it's making a transition from having been a subordinate power.
Yeah. What do you think about two dimensions of this transition? First of all, this is your famous statement that GDP doesn't mean that someone is powerful, or GDP doesn't equal power itself. That's why Russia is much more powerful than Germany, because power is something different than GDP. That's my question number one. And number two is, all this procurement that I mentioned primarily was negotiated with South Koreans, which is a surprise. I may tell you that it is killing people across the European Union, especially Germans, who are going to hate this, that sort of thing. But what is your take on it? That this is South Korea and, geopolitically.
I would look at this as follows. South Korea is as much a part of the American defensive system as Poland. Why shouldn't South Korea sell the weapons? The United States is not that hungry to sell weapons because there's limited production and so on. So it certainly is a reasonable thing that two American allies purchase tanks from each other. Whether you need tanks or not is another question we can have, but why not? So one of the virtues of the American imperial system, as we would call it, okay, is that it does not require a centralized source of weapons or other things. You want to deal with the South Koreans, deal with the South Koreans, but you're still dealing with us. And in that sense, it strengthens two ends of the alliance system. But as to not buying European tanks, okay, well, the European tanks have not developed. The French tanks have not developed to cope with many things.
They can't produce the numbers, so.
Well, they can't produce the numbers. They also have not modernized sufficiently. The Germans are terrified of their own tanks, the Leopards, trying to get rid of them. Europe is not prepared for war. It is in the illusion that because they've created the European Union, they've abolished war. Well, now that fantasy, which I wrote about was a complete fantasy, is shattered. They're on the margin of the war, but they're also in it, and they're not prepared for it. Interestingly, psychologically, at least, Poland was prepared for it. This was a difference, where Germany genuinely believed the nonsense that war has been abolished in Europe. How could that be? Poland believed the war was coming. Poland also saw itself as a weak and a victim. And it climbed out of that hole of feeling like a victim. Perhaps too proud for the moment, but it's better this way. It's so that really is one of the remarkable things and why I thought that Poland would be a great power. Because psychologically, it was so wounded in World War II. The Jews say never again.
Yeah.
The Poles say this in church, never again. And this drove them into the current position they're in. Mm-hmm. I think the Russians are genuinely afraid that they would have to deal with the Poles.
I think so too. And really, what our leaders has been speaking up loudly is really, I mean, that we're gonna take on them, and we're gonna have the largest land force in Europe.
Yes, but the largest land force in Europe will still not be able to take on the Russians without the Americans.
Sure.
And we really don't want to take on the Russians. What we want to do, the problem in this war is this. Russia has a perfectly reasonable fear. They're now 263 miles away, potentially, from an American force. And it's America that they think about. And if I were a Russian, I would want to have strategic depth. I would want to get away. The problem is the only way to get away would take Ukraine, and then they're on the borders of Poland and Hungary and Romania, and that the United States couldn't stand. It doesn't want to get into another one. So you have two great powers, each of whom is terrified of what the other might do, using proxies, Ukrainians or what have you, to solve the problem. It's not a soluble problem. We cannot live with the Russians on the Polish border. This is not something that America can tolerate, nor can Poland, by the way. The Russians can't live with us on the eastern border, almost to Moscow. They lose their strategic depth. So what we're also learning is that the Russians have not developed weapons for the battle that they're facing. They're trying to develop them now. They didn't have the strategy and so on. So the United States is undergoing a massive reevaluation of Russia. And so is Poland. Different conclusions may be drawn. The American conclusion may be drawn. This is not something we have to deal with. These people can't possibly do it. The Poles will have, this is an opportunity for us. And there'll be a disagreement. But there's no question but that a fundamental change is taking place between the European peninsula and the Ural Mountains. The way that Europe works. And the most important thing that I notice is the utter irrelevance of the EU.
Yeah, yeah. And speaking of that, the Germans lost this dominance in Europe. I mean, I can't imagine the situation after this Ukrainian war in Ukraine, that Poles would accept any dictate from Berlin in terms of the, how EU is functioning after, this gas deal. And especially after it turns out that Germany is so weak that, that they can't probably survive the winter, and their industry will go bust if they don't get gas from other members of European Union, where now they demand solidarity, which they didn't want to give earlier, to the people financially and otherwise.
And this is what has given Poland its historic moment. It's faced with two enemies, Russia and Germany, and both are weak. They have different sorts of weaknesses, different structures, but they are nothing like they used to be. Here's Poland in the middle between them, still frightened of both in different ways, and sometimes the same way, and not that confident as Germany was, or as Russia was. And this is how great powers emerge. Now, being a great power is a very difficult thing. As a citizen of a great power, I can tell you many times I wished I weren't, because your children will go to war and all of that. But you have no choice either. This is your opportunity, and you will take it. And one of the aspects is buying weapons, and some will be useful and some will not. Yeah. But this is what it looks like.
Yeah. Yeah, we will see how it all develops. Yeah. So right now, we are sending all weapons to Ukraine, 500 tanks altogether. Not to innumerable amounts of other equipment. This is in stark contrast to what the Germans and French are doing, actually. And Poland is not a very rich country, and still we're sending stuff.
So two things have emerged. There were two players here. One was the United States, whose economic power I never understood until they unleashed it. And the other is Poland. These two countries, and now the Americans are putting permanent bases into Poland, if you let them. These two countries have formed an alliance, and they're the only dynamic countries. The British, perhaps, always are with the Americans. But there's a new coalition forming. And that coalition is not an inter-European, but a trans-European coalition of Poland, the United States, probably Britain, South Korea, the entire alliance structure suddenly coming to bear within Europe. The danger here is that the Russians must do something. They're watching this happen, and they must be thinking, I would be thinking, I have to disrupt this process. And I'm having trouble with long-range assaults because I have no logistical ability to fuel them. So very strange things come out of Kiev. Very strange arrests and heads of security and heads of special operations going. Yeah. You begin to think about what intelligence service would be trying to destabilize Ukraine. Well, it's not us. We don't want to destabilize it. But if I were the Russians and I were in a difficult position, it took me so long just to take an area that was right on my border. What is it going to take for me to reach deep into Ukraine? Well, one way to do it is to destabilize the country. And of course, the Russians had sources in Ukraine, and I'm sure the Americans had them too. I hope we did. But the Americans don't want to destabilize them. But we're seeing something very dangerous and very odd taking place in the Ukraine. And it's hard to understand Zelensky's position, but for the moment, this event is more important than the battle on the ground. And if that were a Russian strategy that was succeeding and it destabilizes, well, then Poland becomes a front.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Yeah, we will see what's going to happen. We'll see. I also wonder what the last question I had for George. Does it change your opinion about China? And do you think that China might make a move soon, given the poor performance of the Chinese economy, this turmoil across Eurasia? At the end of the day, still the attention of the U.S. on Ukraine. So what do you think? What is the dynamics there?
Well, geography is such that China can offer almost no help to the Russians. The Russians can help no. China is in its normal, like Japan, like the United States. At a certain point, you reach a limit of what you can do. And when you can reach that limit, it destabilizes the country. What we know is they're no longer threatening Taiwan. It was a very silly idea. They couldn't reach Taiwan. They're opening talks with the United States on various levels. They're coming to terms with the fact that their extraordinary explosion is over, and now you're in a normal country again. But Ukraine has to transit to being a normal country. As to the relation with Russia, I have no idea what it means. I don't think Putin told the Chinese that they were planning to go to war. And as soon as they started to go to war, the Chinese started rushing to the other side. So what's happened here is that as this war is heated up, the events in the South China Sea, where the Americans and the Chinese face each other, has cooled off like a great deal. Nobody is trying to make believe that they're going to go to war. So that's, from the American point of view, a great comfort. We are interested in trade with China, but they have to be interested in buying from us. But in either case, we are in a war that, from the American point of view, is the ideal. They take a lot of American weapons, and it's a proxy fight. There are no Americans dying, and the Poles are not dying because we're getting them to die. They're protecting their country. Okay? And here is where, we can be of enormous help. And Poland can be of enormous help because you understand the Ukrainians much better than we do. So chances are, if you look at what's happening in Kiev, you have a much better idea what's going on than I do.
Yeah, Strategy&Future is planning to go to Kiev in the front line, some of us at least, in September to check on our own, because we are trying to draw lessons for the Polish military. So
I would go with you, but I would have to lie on the ground and hide. I'm a coward.
I'm afraid that it will be my case as well. But I have, more heroic persons in my team than myself.
I don't like heroes. They're dangerous. They can be killed.
I understand. Thank you, George. George Friedman, Jacek Bartosiak. That was a great conversation. Thank you. Thank you, George.
And goodbye to all of Poland. I wish you well.